He is a postgraduate in science and had a stint in Science Reporter as its assistant editor. Later moving to Mysuru, he continued his science communication activities as a columnist in popular newspaper. His column in Kannada Prabha is known to be the second long-standing science column in Kannada and was published every week for 16 years and published over 2,000 articles in Kannada and 250 in English. He also has experience in preparing programs for All India Radio as a coordinator for Vigyan Prasar Bharati programs in Kannada during 2008 to 2013. He has scripted 75 radio dramas on science on various topics and helped train script writers in writing and editing scripts for radio. He is closely associated with 5 community radios in Karnataka in planning and preparing science programs. Before, he is a pioneer of podcast in Kannada and science podcast in any Indian languages, which has completed 4 years. The podcast reaches around 3,000 listeners directly through social media every day. Over 800 episodes have been podcast, which stand Jana Sudhi among the 1% of consistently regular science podcasts in the world. Professor Sharma is presently coordinating the Kuttuhalli SCOP project in Canada. He is a regular trainer in translation workshops organized by the National Translation Mission and is a recipient of the Best Popular Science Writer Award by the Karnataka Science and Technology Academy and Best Science Communicator Awards instituted by the Vision Group on Science and Technology by the Government of Karnataka. He was selected as a finalist for the international competition Breakthrough Engage during 2009 for this effort in science communication through podcast. Now I invite Professor A.S.K.V.S. Sharma to deliver the lecture on translation science and communication. I welcome you, sir.
The topic is translation, science, and communication. It gives a different connotation. So I'll be talking mostly about translation of science text and communication because these are two important factors. Just now we had a fantastic talk by Dr. Tariq Khan, especially on interpretation. So most of the concerns that translators have in transforming ideas from one language to another have been expressed in the talk that Tariq Khan gave. Almost we need to, as translators, we need to look at those concerns, specifically how the culture of one language determines the meaning of the sentences there and how understanding that becomes important. Secondly, the vocabulary that you need to understand. And then third is how do you transform that into a specific audience. That means an interpretation is always oriented towards the audience. The focus is on the audience. At the same time, the fidelity, that means your interpretation should be as close to the original as possible. However, there is always a need to change that depending upon the audience. Say, for example, when I am interpreting a science talk to a village audience, who may not be understanding a lot of science, then it becomes important that the interpreter also interprets the concepts to the listener. So this is what we call as audience focus, and this audience focus is especially important when we talk about science and technology translation as well as communication. I have translated a good number of articles, and probably that is one of the reasons why NTM every time requests me to talk about science and technology translation. One of the things that we usually think is that the translation process is similar in every case. That need not be. Although it is changing from one language to another, what is important is that there are some fine details, especially when it comes to knowledge subjects, knowledge areas. It can be science, it can be economics, it can be sociology or other things. And these are these finer details have to be kept in mind to understand the source text as well as to translate that into the target audience. And that is what I will be discussing. So what is so different about translation of SNT text is the focus of my thought today. And when I say translation, I am reminded of this word by Shakespeare. A primrose by the river's brim was but a dicotyledon to him and nothing more. This is what he says about a scientist. What he means is that science doesn't use a different language, it is a different language. That means the entire faculty of science, what we see in anywhere in the world, uses its own unique vocabulary, its own unique grammar, and its own language. Maybe it is English or Japanese or Chinese, it doesn't matter. Script doesn't matter. The language is a totally different language. Secondly, when we talk about that's the problem that we have. The science is a different language, and how do we interpret or translate that into a common English, common Kannada, common Hindi, common Urdu, or common Telugu? And the second question that raises is that why do we need to translate? Of course, this must have been discussed at length during the course of the period, but with regard to science, especially the science that we see today could spread around the world mainly because of translation. Without that, this knowledge could not have been present everywhere. Secondly, translations have not been limited to two languages or anything. It has spread everywhere. If you look at this, even 3rd century before Christ, Ptolemy was speaking in Greek and it was translated to other European languages. And there was extremely very good knowledge available in with the Jews, and which was translated to Greek. And for this reason, there is a story. It's not a story actually; it's a history that we have heard of the Greek famous Alexandrian library, and the king brought 72 prisoners to exclusively translate Hebrew texts into Greek so that the knowledge of Jews could be brought to the Europe. And this was what he did. After translation, these prisoners of war, were released. So the translation of science and technology has been in focus for quite some time, but it has gathered a lot of you know attention recently, mainly because there have been a lot of changes in the structure of the scientific society, or the way that we do science and the way we talk science, and also in the political structure. And because of these things, we are now talking more and more about translation of science and technology between various languages. And this is a example of how the translation helped knowledge spread from this. This is the earliest mention of what is called as zero. Zero, if you remember, was invented in India, and this was later taken to Persia, and from there it spread to Greek, Europe, and then again came back to us in the form of binary or digital forms. And this particular record is dated around 1500 BC, and it is found not in India, but it was found somewhere in near between the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this particular document is now known as the oldest written record of zero. Before that, zero was being used in the oral tradition. So translation has always helped us to spread the knowledge. And when it is not just the ancient, this one, in the modern science also needed the help of translations. And this is the 1923 textbook, 1918 textbook published in Karnataka, where we had, the universities starting at that time, and the zoology textbooks were translated into Kannada, and you see it here, the translations here. What is interesting is that the translator was not a scientist, so we cannot assume that a translator, we need it. It is not necessary that a translator has to be a scientist always. This particular text was translated by a poet, and a lot of literary literatures actually did translation of science and technology. So it's nothing new that the science and technology texts were or translated. But what is new today is that people hesitate to translate science and technology texts because they say that it is much more difficult than the usual translation. My interpretation of this, I call it as interpretation, is that it's not as difficult if we understand the culture of science, the language of science, and why scientists write that way. And once we understand these aspects, probably it will be easier for us to handle the translation of one language, translation of scientific and technological texts into another language. And this is another example of the same kind of translation of higher educational text. This text is on, of course, nuclear physics, originally written in German by the famous Nobel laureate Werner Heisenberg. And the same was translated by Dr. Lakshmi Narayana Acharya, a professor of Sanskrit and German in the then Madras University in Chennai. And it was translated into Kannada in 1962, just 4 years after the German text was published. So but then this was the kind of translation activities that was going on in science and technology, but somehow this fell apart after some time, especially in the second part of 20th century. And there are many reasons for that. Uh, so when it comes to translation, we all know that it is transformation of knowledge from one language to another. It could also be transformation of idea from one language to another, or the culture. And what we need to understand is the third point, is that transformation also must include a part of communication. What do we mean by communication? The second thing is, when we talk about science, if I take a Shakespearean literature, probably all the texts would be the same class. Whereas if I take a science text, there are different classes, mainly because the texts address different audience. It is not the same. So when there is a text that is describing the gravitational force and its effects on various objects, in a textbook, the language will be totally different. Whereas the same thing, when it is described in a primary research journal, it will be totally different. And when the same knowledge is being given to a common man like me, then the nature of the text will be totally different. So in science, this is the major problem. The scientific text, its structure, its grammar, and its syntax, the vocabulary, everything depends upon the audience that it is looking at, or the target audience, or the readership that it is looking at it. And that's one of the reasons why we find that some texts are difficult to translate, some texts are easy to translate. And we usually think of translating texts which are much easier as an easy option for that. And second thing is, there may be a question of why we should translate, like why we should interpret, that Dr. Tariq Khan asked. The reason is very simple. Sometimes it can be very practical to have this knowledge or this skill, I would say, because there are many areas where science and technology translation is becoming very, very important. I know of many of my friends who are not in the scientific field, but who are translating science and technology texts for several of the companies, because generally the science is discussed around the world in English, but then it also is required to be understood by common men who do not understand or who do not have the ability to read and write English. And in that case, the translation becomes very, very important. One example is that if you buy a smartphone, it comes along with a manual, and this manual is very, very important, because uh, the generally we understand simple operations of a smartphone, but if we have to use it to the full potential, then we need to understand how each and every operation can be handled, and this is what the manual carries. And these manuals uh, are generally translated into the respective languages. If you look at a manual, you will find almost from Spanish to English to Japanese to Chinese and Hindi, because in India both Hindi and English are relevant, and therefore most of the manuals will have this. And if there is an exclusive marketing in a specific state like Karnataka, then there can also be a Kannada translation for that. So this is an important thing that happens. And similarly, you find a lot of opportunities in other areas like advertising, commercial advertising, or dubbing. These are all areas where translators become important. I remember long back, 30 years ago, when I was a student, a documentary was prepared in English, and I was asked to translate the script into Kannada, because it also related to the Karnataka people. And at that time, I was paid a princely sum. Okay, so if we have this kind of you know, skills, and know how to handle our skills, probably it will also be worthwhile, very worthy, and very valuable, and is you know, commercially viable activity also. This is a preface to a text written in 16th century, printed at that time. It was a translation of Galileos text from Italian to English, and the transcriber generally notes what a translator should remember and should not. He says all apparent printer's errors are retained. Maybe today we may differ from him. Variation in punctuation or as in the original, but missing full stops at the end of paragraphs have been applied. There are inconsistencies in the use of italics, spacing of words, and use of full stop after axiom, abbreviations, etc. All are retained to match the text. So you see, the translator here has given a lot of importance to the fidelity of the text, or the form, or the way it is presented also. This is one of the reasons why. But then if you are translating today the say science and technology text, maybe we will have to change a little bit some of these concepts, because the language has not been the same. It is a dynamic entity, and the science and technology language has undergone a sea change. The text what we are talking about here is 17th century, when Galileo wrote in very simple Italian language. Whereas today, every scientist writes in English, but that English is not the common man's language. And that is the crux of the problem for the translators. Now, science communication is important, and it usually means that what a scientist imagines has to be conveyed to the listener in the same way. So if the source imagines a tree, it has to be conveyed as a tree to the audience also. If that doesn't happen, then probably the communication fails. And for these things, we need to look at three important aspects. One is the the topic has to be, the translator has to focus on the topic. Then he should have the clarity in the language in which he writes. And then there is one aspect of science and technology text which is very impersonal and very unique. And then none of the text says that yes, I did this or he did that or something like that. There won't be any person or any emotions in a text, and that is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for readability. When it comes to readability, the general notion is that for a translator, scientific text is difficult to translate because the readability is also less. And the readability here means the number of common words that is used in a scientific text, very commonly used text. In 1992, Dr. Hayes, Desmond Hayes, uh, produced a sort of a score to differentiate between different types of different readability of text. So the most readable, he says, is that of newspapers, which have for almost 1,000 to 2,000 years have retained the same set of words to convey the meaning of different topics, whereas the different the science or knowledge subjects have they developed their own vocabulary, and these vocabularies are not commonly used. So the difference between the subjects vocabulary to the commonly used vocabulary is what is called as the lex score. If there is a huge difference, the text will be very difficult, and if there is a very closer resemblance between the, that means the use of common words are more in the text, then it becomes easier to read. This is one of the classifications that we use in science and technology texts, also in other texts, to measure the readability. It's called lex score, and there is a software also to do that. Okay, and based on this, we can always classify the scientific text into three different types. And these three different types are not any academic classification. This is only a classification for my simple use of explaining why the translation becomes difficult from different texts, between different texts. So one of the things is that what we call as peer or primary knowledge texts, and these are the texts that are used to communicate between peer groups. Peer groups is if a scientist is working in a specific field like physics, if he wants to speak to another physicist, his language will be totally different. And the text that he writes to communicate to the another physicist is also different. These are mostly found in research papers or reviews or perspectives published in various research journals. As I said, the target group of this kind of writing are generally the peer group. Okay, and the second thing is when it comes to lex score, it will be very low, and therefore the readability will be very low for a commoner. For a physicist, it may not look like that, but for others, the text would look alien. And that is the important thing. The next level of text is something in between this and the common text, what I call as secondary level text. Generally, we find these in the textbooks of undergrad courses, where a lot of common words are used, but at the same time, a good number of technical words are also used. I hope I don't have to explain to you the difference between a technical word and a jargon. And please, if you need to know, please let me know. But otherwise, generally the technical words define a specific aspect of this. The jargons usually are related to the culture, and therefore in science and technology you find a lot of technical words. One of the common problems that we face is that do we need to translate all those words that are found in the science and technology text which are technical. So the question we will answer at a later date. Here again, the readability will be a little better, and the quality of scientific text, there are certain qualities which we define, will be very nearer to the common language than to the scientific language. And the tertiary knowledge text is the one which picks up knowledge from both these type of primary and secondary, and then writes it or translates it into a common language. So it can be in English, it can be in Chinese, it can be in Kannada, Telugu, or any language, it doesn't matter. But the type of text, or the syntax, or the readability, or the understanding, comprehensibility of the text is much higher than in other texts for a common man. And therefore, this is I refer to this as the tertiary knowledge text, because its a source of knowledge is something different, and this is only at a different level. So we can think of newsletters, pamphlets, popular science writings, reports, news items that are published in the newspaper, feature articles. All these are uh, can be classified as tertiary knowledge texts, and these are specifically targeting people who do not work in the similar field. And so if I say it's a non-peer group, the tertiary knowledge text becomes comprehensible to a non-biologist if the text is a physics one. Okay, and the lex score is very low. And these three classification means that the science and technology texts have some qualities, and the primary text has a very high quality with regard to that. The secondary text has a little medium quality, and this one has a much easier or low quality. So the low, high, and medium, what I refer, doesn't mean evaluation of that. It is only to say the difficulty of or the nature of the text that we have here. So some of these qualities that we find in a text are these. One is specific lexicon, or the jargons are used extensively in the scientific text. Say, for example, if we are talking about physics, the language will be totally different. The words that are used will be totally different from the words that are used in a biological text. And similarly, the syntax might be the same, but then the vocabulary will be different. And in almost all the scientific texts, the passive voice is dominant. Passive voice, there is no text which says that which has an active voice. Most of the text will be passive. Of course, in English, the passive voice is quite common, and it's also readable. Whereas in an Indian language like Kannada or Hindi or any other Indian language, the passive voice jars, and therefore, whenever we translate, we could always attempt in changing this passive voice to an active voice. It is not impossible, and it is not also changing the uh, context or the content of the text, but it makes the text much more readable. So we have to keep in mind, most importantly, this particular aspect of scientific text. The second thing is a lot of words joined together to form a single word. So what we call as a dense meaning sentences. So in one sentence, there will be a lot of concepts packed together. That is another problem. And these co-jointed words can sometimes become phrases themselves. Another issue that is with regard to science and technology text. Do we have to retain them as it is, or do we have to expand them in a translation? Becomes contextual and very important, significant. Also, it provides a lot of challenge. At the same time, it becomes very much essential if you are looking at communicability of the text here. Then the other thing that is very distinctive about science texts are the use of symbolic, pictorial, or graphical text. So there will be a lot of graphs in a text which have to be interpreted sometimes. Sometimes they may also have been described in the text, but if they are not described in the text, probably we will have to interpret them also. And then there is what is called as abbreviated text, which is a sort of a hurdle for every translator. And these are the important aspects of a qualities of a scientific text. Besides this, when we talk about the qualities of the text, see, these kind of specific grammatical features are found largely in scientific texts. So like interlocking definitions, a lot of definitions of lot of words can be mixed up together. So if you find there is one word and you want to understand the meaning of that, you will have to also understand another word. Without that, it is not possible. For example, when they say that arge derived fuel, so fuel is okay, but that is not the meaning that we are looking at. The meaning is that the fuel which is extracted from algae is important. So algae derived fuel. So it is not just one of these things. So interlocking definitions will be there. Then there will be technical taxonomics. So that means when they say that it is a moderate rain or moderately strong rain or extremely strong rain, they are not simply a gradation. They have specific meanings. That means there is a specific quantity of rain that has happened. So these things also have to be understood by the translator. And then some special expressions will be there or new words might be there. Then you have technical lexical density. That means a sentence may have a large number of nouns strung together into one clause, and that will be very difficult to translate. I'll show you some examples of that. And another important aspect, or rather bad aspect of science and technology text, is that the sentences are very hugely large sentences with a lot of noun clauses included. And sometimes a sentence can run into a paragraph itself. So this is another problem. Then metaphors will be there. Then there will be a lot of assumptions about the target audience comprehensibility. So therefore, when somebody says that the gravity is half g, 0.g, he assumes that g, the reader knows what is g and what is half g. So these kind of semantic discontinuities also are part of science and technology text. And unless we understand why these are used, how these are used, translation becomes a little more difficult. You can translate and it will become a literal translation, but the readability will be suffering a lot. And the communication, that which is at the core of all the translation activities, will also suffer. And therefore it is important that we keep these things fine. This I have already explained. Now let me just talk about a few of these things that we find in the text. Nominalization is one of the things. See, for example, if there is a noun, the noun is also converted into another noun of a action. Okay. Now, for example, let me just tell you about circle. Circle is, all of us know that it is a shape, and a circulation is that something that happens following that shape. Okay, it starts from one place and comes back to the same place. So that's called circulation. So this is the nominalization, which is very common in science texts. And what happens is that for a translator, when he is translating some text, should he translate both these forms? The blastula may not be, but then blastulation, should he translate that or should he explain this? And if it is translation, generally what happens is that we in Hindi or in Kannada, they do this blastuli karan. So this kind of translation of words generally hinder the readability of a text unless you do not have you have a condition that the text has to fit into a specific number of words. Probably you can take a liberty in explaining this blastulation, saying that it is the process of formation of blastula or something like that in your language. Then it becomes easier. But the limitation of space or limitation of words doesn't mean that we lose sight of communication, and that is an important aspect. The jargons become other important aspect of hindrance here. For example, transfection or confocal image, conjugate, immunofluorescence. These all look very, very strange and difficult words. However, we need to understand that these are actually words coined in a different language and then borrowed by English. So generally, most of these words have their roots either in Greek or Latin, and then they are brought into English, and therefore we find that their common meaning is not easily available. Conjugate here is a simple word which means the wedding. So when two bacteria come together and start reproducing in one specific type of process, that is called conjugate. It is a sort of a mating process, and this word comes from the conjugal or the wedding root from Greek or Latin. And similarly, immunofluorescence or confocal image, two focuses, two simultaneously focusing on the same image is the meaning. And this kind of usage is the one which hinders understanding. So unless it is a noun, we may have to translate them into this. Then I told you about the type of text that we have, the passive voice, co-jointed words, noun phrases and all. Here is an example from a science text that we had. OR83B protein kinase C phosphorylation mutants M1, M2 and RCO-PKC synthetic genes were generated. Now look at this. How many words are there? Are there 3 words, 7 words, 14 or 16? Now, if you look at closely, we will find that the number of words are very, very less. For example, OR83B protein kinase C is a single word. Several nouns have been strung together to form another noun, and it represents one chemical. Similarly, you can extend that to phosphorylation mutants M1, M2 and RCO. So M1, M2 and RCO are different. Phosphorylation mutants are one. PKC synthetic genes. So M1, M2 and RCO PKC synthetic genes were generated. So these kind of stringing together of various nouns with very little of action here is one of the major problems. So if suppose we translate the same thing into either Kannada or any Indian language, readability will be one of the uh, uh, you know mm, is something that we lose in the translated text. So we need to keep this in mind and change the voice to active and see how best we can change this. You will also notice that there are a large number of abbreviations used, and those are major problems again. And yes, of course, like I said, the symbolic and pictorial texts are very important. What happens is that if we understand these texts, it is better we interpret them also somewhere, either as a footnote or as a explanation in a parenthesis. I would not suggest parenthesis, because parenthesis when you read a text always interferes. So a footnote would be better, or an endnote would be a important thing. So this kind of interpretation also have to be done in a science text. We have no translations for these. These are just pictures or symbols, and therefore these have to be written as they are. However, when we talk about centigrade, 160 degrees centigrade. It is possible that we write C instead in Kannada as say, representing centigrade or Celsius. Similarly, in Hindi, we can write it as say or in the full form Celsius. Or we can leave it as 160 degree C, because capital C is a universal symbol and that is acceptable. Similarly, for volt, is the universal symbol is V, and that we can retain. And so these are some of the things. So universal symbols: millimeter, centimeter, volt, ampere, centigrade, all these things could be retained in the Roman as they are used globally by various scientists in the same way. So therefore, there need not be any change in these things. However, in some exceptional cases where we already have been using these kinds, like centigrade or mimi for millimeter or semi for centimeter, we can write them in the Devanagari in Hindi or in Kannada in the Kannada script. These are the abbreviations, and abbreviations are two types. One is local or contextual, and the other one is global or universal. When we say HEK293 cells, HEK293 cells are contextual. This is one type of cells that these researchers are growing in their laboratory, and therefore that is contextual. Whereas phospholipase C, or rather CAMP, cyclic AMP, cyclic adenosine monophosphate, is one of the molecules that is called across the world as CAMP only. So therefore, CAMP becomes a universal abbreviation, whereas PLC HEK293 become contextual abbreviations. For example, if I am writing a paper and my name repeatedly appears and it may be abbreviated as A.S.K.V.S, that doesn't mean that the A.S.K.V.S can be used everywhere. It has to be used only in that particular context, in that particular paper's context, not everywhere. Whereas if I have CM, centimeter, or AM as for the hours that we represent, AM, PM. Similarly, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which is another universal abbreviation. These abbreviations can be used as they are. It is important for a translator to explain what these abbreviations means at least once in the text. Though the original text may not explain this, if it is a primary text, it is essential that we in the translated text do this. These are three mantras I remember. I would like to be accurate to the meaning of the text, and then see that the language in which I am translating, to which I am translating, is natural language, in the sense that the literal, it should be readable, it should be audible. Any sound that is pleasant to ears is a good sound, and therefore any text that you can understand or give attention to when you are listening to that is a good text. And this happens if the readability is good and if the language of the text is very closer to the common language or the natural language. And this is what we need to look at in a translation. Lastly, it should be communicative. That means whatever the scientific concept that is there should be communicated to the audience, and that is an important aspect of the things. Many times what happens is that we find that some technical words have to be translated, and in that case what do we do? So these are some of the dilemmas that we face. These are dilemmas, and these dilemmas have to be sorted out all the type of translation that you are required to do, or on the type of text that you are doing, or on the audience. So the translator becomes the deciding authority here. depending upon the context. So sometimes you may have to use the original word, sometimes you may have to change the phrases, not exactly the literal translation. Sometimes it could be literal translation. So these are all different needs of the different texts that we need to look at. Many times I ask people, which of these would you prefer, the black one or the red lines? And usually people say that yes, sometimes they, for certain things they prefer red, certain things they prefer black ones. And that is one of the challenges of translation, whether it is science and technology or economics. Okay, there are several techniques in translations, especially that are used, and the same probably you have already heard about these techniques, but how do they relate to the science and technology translation is what I am going to speak to you today. One is that we borrow when there are no words in our language to symbolize that concept. Let's say, for example, the mouse, or a gene, or a bacteria, or an allele. Amylose is an enzyme. So these are nouns, and they represent an object or a concept or a organism or an object. So a noun can always be, if it is not available in our language, in the target language, it is better to borrow them and use them as it is. Gene we can borrow as it is, bacteria we can borrow as it is, allele we can borrow as it is. Remember, sometimes we make some changes here and there. Bacterium is a singular in English and in the scientific world, whereas bacteria is a plural. When we borrow this into Kannada, we borrow it as a plural. uh, we borrow the plural as a singular. So we write bacteria rather than bacterium, and for a singular, and we pluralize the bacteria into bacteriagalu or bacteriae in Hindi. Bacteriae. So these kind of adjustments are done sometimes when we borrow the text. There are some literal translations also that we find in a lot of Indian science texts. For example, cell is a kosh in Hindi. Similarly, Jiva Kosha in Kannada. Or in Marathi also almost the same is used. And that is because the original root of this word, the word, how it came about is also interesting, because when for the first time when scientists observed the cells under a microscope, they found that they were empty chambers, because they observed a cork slice, and there was no living substance in that, and the only the walls remained, and therefore they found it as a sort of a room, an empty space, an empty room, and they called it as cell, using so the cell was literally translated into various other languages to mean kosha or a box. Okay, and similarly chromosome is what is present in a cell, and this chromosome was translated as varanatantu, because the original word was coined because whenever you add some coloring substance to the cell, it was the chromosomes that first became colored, and they became visible. So only with the color you could see some thread like substance in the inside the cells, and therefore people called it as a chromo, that is colored, zoom object. So the chromosome that's got a name. So this is a technical word. Of course, it's a noun, and you can either use it as a chromosome. There's no harm in that because it represents an object. You can borrow the word as it is, or you can translate. Earlier, this translation of these words using the roots from which they were derived had been in practice. But recent days, if the word can be borrowed easily, directly, and it can be written in a simple form, then it is generally borrowed. Similarly, we have an organ in anga, okay, and in the cells have smaller parts which are called as organelle. And what do we do for this organelle? So what kind of word we should coin for this is a question that we have. Organelle to write in Kannada will also be very difficult. So what we already had a word called kosha. So a part of kosha is koshanga. So we could derive a word similarly to that. So these are some of the techniques that we use. This is a interesting example that I found when we were conducting some seminars, regular seminars in our institute. We had to translate that. It is mandatory to translate every circular into Hindi in central institute or central government establishments, and this is one of the mandate that we had to follow. When this particular factor came, the Hindi officer translated it as uch tanav, hypertension. Hyper is high, uch tension is tanav, so hypertension, uch tanav. But that was not the meaning of the word hypertension. Hypertension these days refers to an increased blood pressure, and it is not an increased anxiety. So whereas uch tanav somehow gave a connotation of anxiety, and so we had to decide between the two. So what we did was to change that into blood pressure. So these kind of communication, whether the particular coined word is usable in a target audience or not, have to be very diligently looked at and then used, because communication becomes very, very important. Communication is the most important thing, and if a word, even if it is the derivation is perfect, it may not convey the right kind of meaning. In that case, we'll have to look at an alternatives. Okay, sometimes these kind of phrases that we use in science, a lot of them are used in secondary texts and also in the primary texts, may have to be reformed in our own languages. It need not be the same kind of thing, but it may have to be reformed. For example, when Neil Armstrong said, "One giant leap for the mankind." One small step for me is a giant leap for the mankind. My colleague translated it as, it's a small step for me, but the Hanuman jump for this, because in our the culture, a idiom representing a giant leap is either Trivikrama step or a Hanuman jump. So to bring the meaning very close to this, so we can also do these reformations. There are many objections also to this, that using Puranic or other idioms in science texts may not be good or anything, but I would always say that if a language has different ornamentations or different idioms and phrases which can be used to convey specific meanings, whether they are from Purana or whether they are from religious texts or non-religious texts, it doesn't matter. It is part of the language, and that we can always use. I use examples, similes, then phrases like this from Puranic texts as well as religious texts to talk to my audience. Adaptation is another area where we can use, say, chlorophyll is a green substance that is present in all the leaves that we see in the green plants, and we have a name for that as a chlorophyll. But when the chloroplast was found, chloroplast is a part of chlorophyll was found, then we had to look at a new word. In this case, either we use chloroplast as it is. That means we say that patraharitu is the word that we had earlier coined. Patraharitu is made up of chloroplast, we can say, or we can look at coining a chloroplast which will be related to patraharitu, if we can coin. If not possible, then because this is again a noun, we can retain it as it is. But there is a condition. If writing these words is very, very difficult, or reading these will also be very difficult, because Indian language texts, sorry, Indian language do not have too many of complex combination of sounds. Okay, so to listen to that, an easy flowing sound is always important. And if you have samyuktakshas, too many samyuktakshas in a word, then reading and writing of that will be difficult, will sound strange rather than I shouldn't say difficult. We may practice and become perfect in that, but it will sound strange. Compensation is something that science texts usually follow. Something that you cannot express in the target language will have to be added, or the lack of that has to be compensated somewhere. So we use a lot of glossaries as well as footnotes, things like that, to explain things that we cannot straight away translate. The challenges are there. The language, excuse me, the scientific language also is not static. It is also dynamic. And this is another challenge that we have. When I started writing in 1984, the kind of language that I used was different from the kind of language that I am using today. And this is because the Kannada also has undergone a lot of transformation. In addition, there are other problems that scientists bring into this. One of these four problems are important. Jargons, of course, we know that jargons are either technical words or words specific to that particular culture. Then neologism is where new words are coined to explain some concepts. Then euphemism is some of the, like we say, the globe, the universe, the universe is expanding, or expansive universe. This kind of literary, expressions sometimes, if translated, may not mean the same in the target language. And these are some of the things. Abbreviations I have already discussed. For example, the translation, in translation we need to look at the context or the culture of the language. And here I have taken the word translation. It means different things in different context. In case of medicine or biology, it means how do we use a particular research. How do we use a particular research for the benefit of man? So this is application. In literature, of course, what we are discussing today, the translation, transformation from one language to another. In chemistry, the translation means a different type of structure. Hello, 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 hello. In translation, in chemistry, it means a different, the same structure expressed in a different way. And in mathematics, it is a process. It's a way of doing calculations. So we need to understand. If we understand these things, then it will be easier for us to translate. Similarly, the other challenges are, there are some words which are very common. They look like common words, but they have a different meaning in science and technology context. Model is not Aishwarya Rai or Sushmita Sen. It is a organism, or a cell, or a mouse, or a thing, or sometimes it can be a just mathematical calculation also. Similarly, translation could be is in biology. in molecular biology, especially the way the proteins are produced using the genetic information. Reading is how this information, genetic information, is understood by the translation machinery. Expression is the production of proteins, how much of that is produced. Cry is a gene, cap is a part of a gene, and family is of course a set of group of animals with a similar type of characters. Clad is a part of that. It means branch, and it's a branch of a family. And development is how we grow, and in specifically in biology the connotation is different. Culture is again growing something, it is not what we practice. And I should say sometimes what happens is that when we don't understand these things, a lot of complications can happen. In one case, when we had sent a text for a translation to a outsourcing agency, we had one sentence which said that the East culture was developed for such and such a use. Okay, and what they had done was they had used East Samskriti. East they had used as a borrowed it as it is, but culture was translated as a Samskriti. And it was not Samskriti that we were talking about, and we were talking about growing East. So this kind of, how do we grow the yeast? So that was the context. So this kind of terrible mistakes can happen if we don't understand the context of the words sometimes. And most of the times these kind of challenges we face, these kind of mistakes happen in case of machine translations. Neologism is something that we are very wary of, especially the biologists have this habit of coining new terms at the drop of a hat. We understand that almost 600 to 700 words are created every month. Many of them may not be used for the second time, but some of them will persist. And when they persist, maybe their meaning also changes over the time. Take, for example, the word genome. We have all heard of the word genome, human genome, bacterial genome, and all. The word started with what is called as gene, which was coined somewhere around 1950s to 1940s to represent the information package that determines our characters or in a living organism's characters. And after that, the gene was identified as a part of a chromosome. So then what became was the total number of chromosomes that were present in an organism. We have 46 chromosomes, became genome. So the genome's meaning was if it is a fly, it is 8 chromosomes. If it is a human, it is 46 chromosomes. If it is some other organism, a different number of chromosomes. But subsequently, when we understood that the gene is only a string of nucleotides, then the whole thing changed. Today, the genome represents not just the chromosomes, but the whole human society, the different types of chromosomes that may be present in the entire 7 billion people, because there are about 18,000 genes in every one of us. And how many varieties of each of these genes are present in the world is what is called as human genome. Similarly, when genome was coined in 2010 and all the whole new connotation came, then suddenly genomics, a new subject or a study or a field of study started. When that started, another subdivision happened, that's called proteome for proteins, lipids for fats, genomics, again the study of genome, and metabolomics of all the reaction that happens. So metabolism is the set of reaction that happens in our body, and what all set of reactions happen in the human world is what people started talking about metabolome. similar things. So this coining of new words is one of the major drawbacks of scientific texts and a major hindrance for translators. And I should say that we are not the scientists are not the only culprits. There are also others. For example, prostitute. How would you translate this word, and what would you how would you convey this word to a person? It is a derogatory word, of course, but then how do we translate that? There's no way. So these kind of neologisms are another problems that we have. And artificial intelligence is a technique, but it sounds like we have a different kind of organism there. Similarly, when people say genome is a book of heredity, how do we translate this concept, the book of heredity? And similarly, eye is a camera, people usually say, but then if a person doesn't know what a camera is, how do you translate that to him and say that eye is a camera? So these are some of the problems that we face mm, in this. I have given a text taken from a primary source, which says it is expressed in large basic conic sensilla. Okay, what is expressed? What is expression? So it is not the protein production here. It is the it is the protein production here, and the basic conic sensilla, a nerve cell, doesn't do anything. But then this kind of usage, language use, is one of the important things that hinder a easy translation. But the moment we understand why scientists write this, we can always uh, take a route where we convert this and write it in a readable and understandable manner. Abbreviations, I have discussed about this. This is a rules, the 12 10 commandments. We have 12 commandments here for translators, especially of science and technology. When they have to create a new word in their source language, the set of rules that we follow. The same set of rules are also followed by the technical committees of various, technical translation committees that is set up by the government of India for Hindi or for Urdu, for Telugu, for and other languages, basically Hindu. And we all of us can follow this one. Uh, I should say that in my routine writing, you know, exercises, at least 3 to 4 words I would have to coin. It becomes very much essential. I don't translate every word, but then sometimes we need to do certain concepts which are new and align to our language. We will have to convert them into this. But then what I follow is that I try to find roots that are similar and that sound almost like Kannada, not like Sanskrit or other language. And if we can do that, then the word is easily accepted into the language rather than looked at as an alien word. So while choosing equivalents, we should look at if there are already any words in the language. Say, for example, when I say gold chloride is a chemical made from gold. We have a word for gold already, but we do not have a word for gold chloride. So should we use that? Whereas in the other case, let's say copper. Copper has a word in Kannada, that is tamra, almost same in Hindi and other languages also. And copper sulfate also has a name in Kannada. So we should be using that copper sulfate, a common name for copper sulfate, also in our technical words. Whereas gold chloride is a new word which is not available in Kannada. So we cannot say it is Swarna chloride. We will have to use it as gold chloride only. So this is one of the things. Then borrowed word should be easy on target language. This I have already told. If the word has a lot of samyukta complex sounds, then it is better to avoid that, create a new word. that is easy in the language. But if it is easy, then borrow it. So mouse is easy to borrow, so we borrow it. Meju is easy to borrow, we borrow it. Bus is easy to borrow, we borrow it. So these kind of easy words can be easily, it is better to borrow them directly and use them as it is. New words may be created for verbs or derivatives. When coiling new words, importance should be given to the root, but not the meaning. This is something that was followed earlier. For example, hydrogen was called Jalajanaka. So it was because the hydrogen was supposed to, produce water. So water generating substance was called as hydrogen because the discovery of hydrogen came from water. And the same root was used, hydro and gen. This is the Greek or Latin root that they had, and the same root was used in Kannada, and it was called Jalajanaka. In Hindi also same thing happened, but these days this concept has changed. Now we know that hydrogen is a substance and therefore we use hydrogen as hydrogen only. Then words already in use may be used without change, like swarna or chinna for gold. Okay, if the source jargon is a short word only has to be coined. Yeah, otherwise we'll be expanding the whole thing. If there are more than one word, all of them can be considered as alternative synonyms. We have for gold, we have gold, we have swarna, we have swarna, chinna, honnu. All these things are the same, represent gold in Kannada, and we can use them as synonyms depending upon the context. An, an alien word when accepted in toto. So suppose we are taking a word, borrowing a word directly into our language, then it should be very close to written, very close to its pronunciation. For example, of course, Indian languages, especially the Kannada, Bengali, and all these things, except for a little bit of uh, what we call as okay. When writing, the scripts are phonetic. That means we can represent every sound except Z sound or Ra sound, one or two sounds. We can represent most of the sounds in letters, and that is the beauty of either Devanagari or Kannada or Telugu or even Bengali. And that is how we can write cancer as it sounds in Kannada, or similarly any other name. So when we do this, the important thing is to remember is we first understand what is the pronunciation and transliterate that sound into our script. And this is possible. And the earlier we used to have a lot of problems. For example, when we say Anthony Lavoisier, Lavoisier, L-A-V-O-I-S-I-E-R. The spelling in English is something different, but the sound is something different. And we used to have a lot of confusion. But these days, the confusion can be easily solved because on internet, you just type the word, listen to the sound that comes out of it, that is read, and the same sound you can write in your language. And for Indian languages, this is a advantage. Therefore, when we accept an alien word in toto, as far as possible, we should write it very close to how it is pronounced. The recent problems that we face in technology writing is this: there are many words which are common words but have been given special meaning, like mouse, strange. Strange is a particle in the physics. Up, out, and down are properties of particles. Similarly, spin and translation, capping, cap. So these type of words which sound very common, but they have different and very specific meaning in a, context of a specific science, create a lot of problems. A few examples of references that I would like to give you. This is a book, Biolexicon, a guide to the language of biology. This will help you understand biology if you are a translator, and how biologists use the different language. And Scientific and Technical Translation by American Translator Association sets up a set of guidelines that you can use for translation. And then the language of science tells you about the way the scientists have changed their language and why they did aspects of that by Holiday. Shaping written knowledge also is a sort of the idea about it gives you an idea about how the language has transformed over the years. Public understanding of science is why translation and how translation has played an important role in the public understanding of science, and the history of the entire thing, including the history of how the language has developed. The Science Terms Made Easy is a very useful book by Joseph Elias. It gives you the roots of various commonly used words, scientific and technical terminologies, and because of which it will be easier for us to coin a word in our language. Lastly, in spite of all these preparations and then carefulness and everything, we may sometimes fall short of a perfect translation. There's nothing called perfect translation or a perfect interpretation anywhere. So there will be always some shortcoming between the original source and the target text. Here is an example. This was a sentence in one of the books written by Richard Feynman, a famous teacher, Nobel laureate, and a scientist. He wrote, the book was about, he was talking about Copernicus, and wrote about Copernicus' book, and he said the book was about revolutions, real ones in the sky, and it kicked off what came to be called metaphorically the scientific revolution. Now, here he uses two words, the same word in two different ways, the revolutions and the scientific revolution. The revolutions, the first revolution is about the movement of planets around the sun in the sky, and the scientific revolution is a social change. And the if we have to translate this, like Tariq Khan was saying, that as an interpreter, you should also be open to the expressions that are given by the speaker, and the same expressions, the same moods have to be created as far as possible. And if we have to follow that in this translation, we require one single word that represents two meanings: the revolutions, the movement of planets, as well as the social change. Unfortunately, in Kannada, I found that I could not I couldn't translate this text, and when I found it very difficult, I went to a senior person and asked him. He also said it is very difficult because we do not have a word. But after some time, he did some research and came back. He said that yes, we could have translated this with the pun intact if we had retained one word which has abused or which has become okay, which is not in use right now, but which was there earlier. So in 19th century, we had a word called kranta and kranti, the same word which we use in case of sankranti. And this word meant that about the revolutions of planet. It also meant a change, sociological change. We still talk about kranti as a sociological revolution, whereas we have forgotten the meaning of the same word related to the movement of planets. So it is not that the language, it is not that the word was not there, but the language has changed. So one has to be very alert to this also. You may ask me the next question, can you use Kranta again in this? Yes, why not? But then, do the readers accept? And that is the crux of the problem: communication, readability. And as long as we understand the difficulties of or the hurdles that we have to reach that goal of communicability and readability, science and technology translation is not difficult. Like I said, it need not be translated only by scientists. It is possible that non-scientists, with a little bit of effort, can do a wonderful translation. Thank you very much.